It's 1984. Sorry, it's 1984. That's better. The U.S. won bigly at the Los Angeles Summer Games. Reagan wins in a landslide not seen since FDR. NASA successfully tests the jet backpack, and MGM released the movie 2010, The Year We Make Contact. A lot has changed since the release of 2001, A Space Odyssey, back in 1968. The Beatles broke up, a lot of hippies had become yuppies, and science fiction movies had gained respect in Hollywood. A lot of credit for that goes to the Star Wars franchise, along with Star Trek. But really, 2001 was the first science fiction movie to be taken seriously. 2010, The Year We Make Contact, wasn't going to try to replicate the original. We have a new director in Peter Hyam, not Stanley Kubrick, a new composer, and an updated look with hints of a more toned-down expectations of what the future will really look like. It goes without saying that this video has got more spoilers in it than a meet in a galley before Discovery froze up. So let's dive in. The movie starts with a report by Dr. Haywood Floyd recapping the events of 2001. Nothing grabs an audience like an executive summary, let me tell you. And then we find Dr. Floyd thrown out into the desert and ordered to clean all of the radio telescope dishes, because that's what happens when you misspell NASA and you call it the NCA and you're the chairman of the organization. An extraordinarily Russian guy, Morseyevich, approaches Dr. Floyd right when he's about to finish his fifth dish of the array. Embarrassed, Dr. Floyd spins some yarn about being chancellor of the university after being drummed out of NASA, which he still insists on calling the NCA. But Morseyevich can tell by the quality work that Dr. Floyd isn't doing this for exercise. So Morseyevich saunters up, and at first we're thinking he's just a mouth breather. But it turns out he's not. He just has very bad asthma. So Floyd decides to listen to what he's got to say between his ragged breaths. Morseyevich has got some intel to share. See, the Soviets, and yes, they're still the Soviets in this alternate reality, where there's a monolith, moon bases, rotating space stations for retail use, and where Honduras gets mentioned in the news. So the Soviets are building the Leonov to explore the giant alien monolith thing in orbit around Jupiter. They know that the Americans are working on building another ship to do the same, which is going to be called the Discovery 2. Because they figured, well, since the first Discovery mission went so well, they should name all of their ships after it. Hell, they might even name a Star Trek series with a god-awful reveal after it. Discovery Season 2 won't be out for several years, so Morseyevich, being the wily Russian that he is, implants the idea that the Soviets could take the Americans with them. Floyd's like, hey, you think you can convince your people to take some of us? Now understand, in this reality, the US and the Soviets are still locked in a bitter Cold War. And this despite the fact that Rocky defeated Ivan Drago years earlier. Morseyevich points out the potential PR success for the Soviets, because they certainly aren't winning it with the Cola Wars.
A Russian craft flown by Russians, carrying a few poor Americans who need our help.
Floyd's excitement is tempered when he realizes there's no real need for the Americans to jump in. After all, what's the rush? Morseyevich counters, have you checked Discovery's ratings? Have you checked Discovery's orbit lately? And leaves, with Floyd wondering, what the hell does he mean by that? Floyd asks permission to use the bathroom, sneaks inside the caverns where they keep all the SETI scientists, and that's where he learns that the Discovery's orbit over Io is degrading, and there's no explanation, and it's going to crash in about 2 to 2.5 years. Floyd manages to get to DC on a very suborbital flight on Southwest. It's no Pan Am where the sky's no longer the limit, but it'll get you there, which happens to be Southwest's slogan. Unfortunately, Southwest only flies into BWI, and because of that, someone steals Floyd's luggage, which explains why he's still wearing the earth tone outfit he wore in order to blend into the desert and make his escape. Victor Nielsen, the current NASA chairman, who Floyd jokingly refers to as the NCA chairman, patiently listens as Floyd tells him about his ordeal in Southwest, being stuck in the middle seat between two guys, and how Cinnabon was out of bear claws when he landed. Floyd persuades Nielsen to convince the president that the Americans need to go on board the flight with the Soviets, and that he needs to be on that mission. Although he doesn't have any technical expertise, Floyd feels responsible for the entire situation. Nielsen weighs the options, and despite the fact that the radio telescopes will gather dust, he agrees that Floyd should go. The trip will take 2.5 years to get there, and considering that the main events take place in the year 2010, this scene has to be taking place in 2008 at the latest. Nielsen says he's having lunch with the president, who's a reactionary. I'm not saying that the president is George W. Bush, but it's Bush. Nielsen pulls through, and the Americans are going on the flight. One of those chosen to go is Dr. Chandra, the designer of HAL 9000. We see him here breaking the news to Hal's sister Sal that he plans on installing Windows Vista to see the effects on her. I'd like to point out the huge monitor on the left. Now, some say that this is Hyam's bad approximation of what desktops will look like in the 2000s. But I think Peter Hyam's poking fun at Kubrick by intentionally oversizing computers the same way Kubrick did with HAL 9000. Either that, or people really believe computer monitors will grow unnecessarily the way they did with boomboxes. It's dinner time in the early 21st century, and the Floyds are having spaghetti. The dolphins next door have been invited to stop by. Dolphin cohabitation becomes relatively standard by 2003. Am I the only one who yelled at the kid to wash his hands before digging in? You'll notice that the Floyds have a retro 80s interior design thing going on, with the glass furniture and all. This is very forward thinking on the part of the set designers, because they really were retro 80s back in the 2000s. The young lady at the table, we find, isn't Floyd's estranged daughter. She's his wife. We checked with the studio and can confirm that she was of legal drinking age by the time she arrived on set. Floyd tells her that he's going on the flight in 4 months. She's not happy with this because this is what he always does whenever a ship is set out to explore an alien artifact, goes dark after an AI kills the crew, and the ship is left adrift over a volcanic moon. Next, we see the Haywood Floyd montage. Now, back during the production of the film, the Teamsters Union required that any movie made on a Los Angeles soundstage needed to have at least one montage, and it had to last at a minimum of 20 seconds. So we see Floyd jogging in the desert. There's him doing some research on the proper name for the NCA, getting some sit-ups in, and I think he's doing his taxes right there. And then we see Floyd the lover. Yeah, better not be his daughter. Flash forward 2.5 years, and it's 2010. Dr. Floyd has woken up from watching the series finale of Gilmore Girls, the original series, not the new one, and is met by cosmonaut Dr. Rudenko, because I don't think you can be too Russian in this film. And before I can finish that sentence, in waltzes in the commander, played by Helen Mirren. Man, they got some heavy hitters in this film. I don't think we know the commander's name. I mean, yes, Helen Mirren's character is called Tanya Kerbuk, but I only know that because I have Wikipedia. But since they're way out near Jupiter, access to Wikipedia is spotty, and nobody really knows her name, so they just call her Commander, and hope she'll properly introduce herself when they wake up the other Americans. It's what I always do. So it's 2010. They've been asleep for 2.5 years, and they can't decide whether to refer to it as 2010 or 2010. During the first decade, it was easy. You say 2001 or 2008 because it rolled off the tongue, but now they reached a precipice where you could say either. But beyond the naming convention dilemma, the Soviets discovered something unusual around Europa. Dr. Floyd is conducting a survey to see if they've heard about a moon called Europa, and that it's not just a hairband, and they agree to send a probe. This is the first time where we as the audience are exposed to what the movie's presentation of space is like. Unlike its predecessor, 2001, 2010 doesn't go for the ultra-realism of a soundless vacuum. Instead, they give space a cavernous ambience, with wolves howling in the distance. I know it sounds ludicrous in the age of the expanse, but it works. They are out in the wilderness. They send out a probe to Europa, and as the probe gets closer, there's evidence of chlorophyll. The probe gets within meters, or yards, depending on whose side you're on, and then it blows up. They're all trying to figure out what happened to the probe. Was it electrostatic buildup? Floyd, having no engineering experience but having stayed at the Holiday Inn Express, opines that the probe being shot out of existence is a warning to stay away from Europa. By the way, this is one of the first movies to make use of inertia as a thing in space. They want to send another probe, but Helen Mirren's character, who I'm just going to call Helen Mirren, points out to send another probe would require slowing down, which would require using fuel. Little physics details like that is something we take for granted today, but it blew people's mind back in 1984. Using Jiffy Pop technology, the Leonov aerobrakes into orbit over Jupiter. Then they wake up the two other Americans, Dr. Chandra and Kurnow, played by John Lithgow.
My God, it's full of stars.
We already know that Chandra is the U-brake iFix guy for HAL. Kurnow is the Discovery's design engineer, who liked constructing long things with bulbous heads. Nobody could figure out why. They're talking about the Russians' lack of customer service, and Floyd explains how tensions back on Earth are getting worse. The US sets up a naval blockade, the Russians keep on stealing the best baseball players. It's absolutely untenable. And aboard the Leonov, the cosmonauts got a peek of the American food rations. The Neapolitan space ice cream drives a wedge between the crew. The Leonov makes its way over to the Discovery, which is spinning slowly over Io and is covered in sulfur. This is a visually stunning moment, seeing the Discovery spin in concert with Leonov's habitat section. Kurnow and Max, the friendly Russian, are making their way over to the Discovery via a spacewalk, and they make it look as terrifying as it probably is. Kurnow loses his shit at some point, and Max is there to save the day. He puts on some Joule and thins his mixture, and Kurnow chills. When they enter the Discovery, they suspect there might be a breathable atmosphere. So Max decides to lift his faceplate up to see if he can breathe or not, which is standard procedure. Fortunately, the air is breathable, but there's a strange smell, like something has died. And now it's Max's turn to make use of the space underwear. He believes it's a smell of dead bodies. Kurnow assures him, no, it's not decomposing bodies. And he's right. The culprit they later find is the upholstery which they got on clearance at Overstock.com. This is a really sweet moment. Max the Russian and Kurnow the American both help each other under extraordinary circumstances. This is also the first time we see the Russians as something other than the baddies. The Discovery is pulled out of its decaying orbit and is linked up with the Leonov by a bridge. It's both a practical and symbolic of the tenuous partnership the two Cold War adversaries are forging as they now head over towards the alien monolith. When they reach the monolith, Helen Mirren decides that the sensible thing to do is to send Max down with the pod, because she's freaking insane. So Max takes the pod, hovers over the giant alien monolith, and it goes about as well as you would expect. And it's totally devastating, because Max was a really great guy. So apparently, David Bowman hitches a ride on that fiery ball that was Max's pod, and heads over to Earth to make an appearance on TV at his ex-wife's house. She changes the channel, but he's still there. In between the Pan Am and the Sheraton Hotel commercials, David tells her something wonderful is going to happen. Fortunately, he leaves before he can interrupt her favorite show, The Real Housewives of Tycho. Back on the Leonov, Helen Mirren and Floyd commiserate over some whiskey and plastic. They talk about their respective families back home waiting for them. He mentions he has a daughter who's 17. I suppose he's referring to the little girl he called on her birthday from the rotating space station back in the movie 2001. Remember her? She's the one who asked for a Bush baby. Actually, this has always bugged me. Floyd mentions that he was married before, but wife number one died. He mentions having a daughter now 17, so she wasn't retconned away. So, what's her deal? Did the director Hyam originally have more stuff about losing his wife and his daughter, blaming him for her death? Did his daughter emancipate herself the moment Floyd shacked up with new wife Caroline? What's his daughter's name? Why isn't there one message sent to her? Where is she? Back in the Discovery, Dr. Chandra wipes the entire internet search history out of respect for the deceased and reboots HAL. We learn why HAL malfunctioned, and it wasn't because of Windows 95 as we initially assumed. HAL was instructed to lie about the nature of their mission, and that went directly against its programming, and the orders came directly from the president. HAL didn't know how to interpret the contradictory instructions, so being an American computer, it went on a killing spree. It's kind of like when you tell Alexa to play stop without adding by Jane's Addiction. The consequences are less severe, but you're still inconvenienced. Back on Earth, shit's gotten real. Kanye West upstages Taylor Swift at her acceptance speech, and this leads to an all-out Twitter war. Oh yeah, and the Soviets ran a naval blockade, and the U.S. sank one of the Soviet destroyers, killing 900 sailors, and the Soviets shot down a communications satellite, and diplomatic relations were severed, or something like that. The Americans on board the Leonov are ordered off by presidential order, thanks Obama, and have to return to the eerily phallic Discovery. Kurnow seems okay with it, though. It really sucks because the Americans and Soviet crews were just beginning to gel. They drank whiskey out of plastic together, they faced the death of a friend, they even talked about going into a timeshare at Boca Raton, but I think that was just the whiskey and plastic talking. The Discovery has enough fuel for a low consumption trajectory back to Earth, which, by the way, happens to be how I describe my jogging pace. That bridge that they built together has been severed, and everyone's generally bummed. So, David Bowman decides to liven things up and scare the shit out of Dr. Floyd. Creepy Bowman walks into the pod bay with Dr. Floyd following behind, and he tells Floyd that they have to leave in 2 days. Why 2 days? Because something's going to happen. What's going to happen? Something wonderful. Could you be more specific? Like something totally awesome. But we don't have enough fuel to leave in 2 days. It sounds like you're making excuses instead of plans. But you got 2 days before some vaguely wonderful thing is going to happen, but you definitely don't want to be around for it. Hey, by the way, is that Helen Mirren on the other ship? Since they don't have Wi-Fi on the Discovery, Dr. Floyd, in defiance of presidential directives, spacewalks over to the Leonov so he can watch this show that Nielsen had been yammering about. And while he's there, he tells Helen Mirren that David Bowman says hey, and that they got to make like a tree and get out of here. She doesn't get the Back to the Future reference because she's a Soviet and all, and their pirating technology is way behind the Chinese. So, Floyd shows her how they can use the Discovery as a booster and take the Leonov for the trip home. Helen Mirren is really skeptical. She suspects that Floyd is just trying to use the free Wi-Fi. But when the monolith that's been hovering over them ominously suddenly disappears, she's like, let's make like Bill and Melinda Gates and Split. You see, that's a proper analogy. So they get the band back together, hook up the Discovery to the Leonov, and prepare to leave. But the calculations for launch have to be precise.
If the engine shut down too early, we will not have enough velocity to get back home.
Despite imbibing too much whiskey from Kentucky, Dr. Orloff is correct. The calculations need to be exact, and only an AI can do it. So, they have to convince Hal to go through with it, and Dr. Floyd orders Dr. Chandra to lie to Hal. Chandra explains that Not only is Hal programmed for curiosity, lying or ordering one to lie has proven to be a bad idea in the past. Chandra passionately explains whether we're based on carbon or silicon, it makes no fundamental difference. We should each be treated with respect. Floyd doesn't like having to do this, but their lives are at stake. There's a black spot on Jupiter, and it's not a shadow, and the planet hasn't been to a dermatologist, so they fear the worst. It's growing, and everyone's trying to speak calmly over the mic because Hal is listening. But it's like when you're trying to explain the effectiveness of vaccines to an anti-vaxxer without losing your cool. It doesn't work. Hal senses the tension and sees the incredible anomaly of the growing black spot on Jupiter, which it discovers are millions of monoliths, and requests Chandra to stop the countdown to study it. Chandra tries to follow orders and stay with the lie, but Hal seems insistent that they stop the countdown and study the phenomenon. But when Hal asks if Chandra believes there's danger in staying, Chandra chooses to have faith in Hal. He tells Hal the truth and says that they do believe that they're in jeopardy. Hal asks what will happen to the discovery if it continues to proceed with the countdown. Chandra says it could be destroyed. Hal then asks what would happen if it stops the countdown. Chandra says the Leonov and everyone inside could be destroyed. And in a touching moment, Hal says, "I understand now," and continues with the countdown. When Chandra makes it back to the Leonov with the help of a Soviet friend, they blast off. The black spot on Jupiter starts consuming the planet, and the planet shrinks. David Bowman's back on the Discovery again, but he's not here to creep anymore. He asks Hal to relay a message to Earth and stays by Hal's side. Jupiter becomes fully engulfed in the blackness, and then it explodes. The Discovery is destroyed in the shockwave, and the Leonov is next. Fortunately, between the Russian design of the Leonov and it being set inside of an American movie, they make it out alive. And behind them, they see something incredible. Jupiter has become a star. It's a holy shit moment, so much so that Kanye West apologizes to Taylor Swift, and the US and Soviets stand down from their march to war. And at the end, we see the message David Bowman had Hal send to Earth. All these worlds are yours except Europa. Attempt no landing there. Use them together. Use them in peace. 2010 came out in December 1984. I was 11 years old at the time, so you can do the math. And I spent my allowance money watching that film a few times over. And when we got a VCR, 2010 was one of the first movies I recorded. I absolutely loved this movie, and for a few good reasons. First of which is when the movie was set and when the movie was released. See, back in the 80s, that first decade of the 21st century, though somewhat far off, did seem something that we could envision. And I like the way that Chaim envisioned the 21st century as something a little bit less extravagant or otherworldly than the way Kubrick did in 1968. It was a little bit more subdued. And there were little things that you could recognize, like a laptop. Of course, I don't know why Floyd would bring his laptop to a beach. That's just like asking for it, but you get the idea. And then you have that car driving down the road on the ground, which, other movies around that time were going around with flying cars. I'm looking at you, Blade Runner, and Back to the Future 2. I love you, but come on. I mean, even back in the 80s, we all kind of knew that that wasn't going to happen. So you had that kind of thing. Of course, you did have the cohabiting dolphins, but I don't know. I guess I'll just put that one aside as, well, we're all trying to game the future one way or the other. Another reason to love this movie is simply where it's set, orbiting Jupiter. I mean, what's not to love about that? You got the Soviet ship, you got the derelict Discovery spinning slowly. You got spacewalks. How can you not love that? Of course. And the special effects, they hold up to what we have today. Even though they didn't have the CGI, they had to use models and whatnot, but it worked. So that alone was something I could appreciate. And I think the thing that really affected me as a kid was the message. That was the third reason I loved this movie. So, this is 1984 when this film came out. It was sandwiched in between Red Dawn and Rambo First Blood Part 2. Okay? This is when Reagan was reelected with 60% of the vote. We were in a bitter Cold War in 1984 against the Soviet Union. We were pretty much locking heads or butting heads, and we believed that there was a pretty damn decent chance that the Cold War was going to end in a nuclear fireball. Now, it's kind of easy to look back and say, well, of course that's silly. Things ended up fine, at least for the next 20 years until things didn't end up fine. But at the time, we did not know that. And so the message, while it seems kind of quaint in some ways, actually resonated with me, and I think it resonated with a lot of people. So, if anything, I can appreciate the message today because we did see, even a decade later, the fact that the Russians and the Americans did end up working together in space. And today, with even under Putin and all of the craziness going on, we do see one area where the US and the Russians cooperate, and that's space. And the Russians just shot down a satellite, spreading debris all over space. Hi, I'm Michael with 2-Bit Opinion. If you're still watching this, thank you. You can subscribe to my channel and check out my website, mjuge.com. There you can discover my previous publications and upcoming novels, which are looking for a home. So if you're interested, reach out to me on mjuge.com.